But we're glad to have you all here today. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth US Asia Center. It's wonderful to have this audience here in the room, and I'd like to express our welcome to the audience online as well, including those wonderful participants who have agreed to call in from throughout the region to join us for this conversation. It is a great honor for us today to launch a report of the Perth US Asia Center, Fueling Cooperation, the Indo-Pacific Hydrogen Transformation. When you talk about something that is at the same time both as elemental as hydrogen and yet high-tech and cutting edge, it reminds me that it is the tradition of the Perth US Asia Center and the University of Western Australia to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And as we talk about issues like we're talking about today, it is clear that we have much to learn in this process. We are very fortunate today to have with us the Honorable Alana McTiernan, Minister for Regional Development, Agriculture and Food, as well as the hydrogen industry. We will be joined momentarily, they're here in the building already, by the Honorable John Olsen, Chairman of the Perth US Asia Center Board, but also former Premier of South Australia, former Consul General in the US, and current Chairman of the American Australian Association, as well as Professor Stephen Smith, who serves on our board, but is also former Foreign Defense and Foreign Minister and serves as CEO of the University of Western Australia Defense and Security Institute. We have with us the Consul General of Japan, Todo Suzuki. So honored to have him with us. As you'll see during the course of our conversation, Japan plays such a very important role in any of these considerations. Rebecca Brown, who is the Director General of the Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science, and Innovation, and the Honorable Brad Pettit, excuse me, Brad, I kind of double-T'd that last name, member for the South Metropolitan Area. And all of you, both online and otherwise, I'll be introducing some of our online participants in just a minute. But first and foremost, we're very fortunate to have Minister McTiernan here to share with us an opening keynote address to help us kind of frame the discussion that we're going to be having during the course of our conversation today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Minister McTiernan.
Thanks very much, Gordon, and fabulous to be here on the banks of the Derbarl Yerrigan. And of course, always start off by acknowledging that we're on Noongar country. And I was talking just before to Kate George about the incredible opportunities this whole hydrogen industry has potentially for Aboriginal communities right around Western Australia, an opportunity to get in on the ground floor now that native title determinations have been made over most of the state. So exciting opportunity for Aboriginal communities. To Suzuki-san, fantastic to have you here. Japan as just such an important trade partner for us here in gas, and hydrogen is a gas. And to Tanaka-san, who is joining us virtually, I believe. Tanaka-san, thank you. Fiona Simon from the Australian Hydrogen Council, fellow panelist, and if I can acknowledge Stephen Smith. Is Stephen here? In the building. Oh, right, okay. And of course, Brad Pettit, my parliamentary colleague. So look, we're really, we've been banging on about this, the potential of hydrogen industry since we came into government in 2017. So we're really pleased to be here, to be involved in the launch of of this report prepared by James Bowen on the hydrogen transformation and the Indo-Pacific's energy future. We know the Perth US Asia Centre has been strengthening relationships and really been very much about strategic thinking between Australia and in the Indo-Pacific and the US. And your think tank has an important tradition. So we're really looking forward to the presentation today. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of a cap of where we are going with this. When we started on our journey, and as I said, in 2017, having had an early experiment when we were last in government with a few hydrogen buses, but when we started seriously seeing this as a new industry, of course, our thoughts immediately went to our traditional trading partners of Korea and Japan and China, where we have many decades of tradition of importing our product, and we were recognizing that that in those communities, communities were making a commitment, particularly Japan and Korea, had made a decision that they wanted to decarbonize their economy through the medium of hydrogen. And so the very first way in which we brought all this together was in 2018 with a big international conference. I think it was the first international hydrogen conference in Australia. Oh, sorry, can I just also recognise, sorry, I forgot, Rebecca Brown down there from head of JETSI and the agency that we are working through to deliver this. But so we were really pleased with the number of Japanese and Korean business houses that participated in that forum, telling us that there was a very clear interest. So since then, we have continued to work very, very closely. Now, I would like to, if I can give a plug here, certainly we see the many European interests coming forward and being prepared to invest. We would love to see some of the investment from our Asian partners coming forward as well. So we know that your investment in LNG and iron ore has been very critical, and we would love to see that investment also occurring, particularly in the green hydrogen space. Because we do need, as always in Australia, we've got lots of land, but we certainly need the capital to get these mega projects up and running. So, of course, most of you here, I presume, would know, YWA. What's our big claim to fame in this regard? Well, first of all, we just happen to have some of the highest quality of renewable energy resources around the place, and particularly important in many of these areas, we've got very, very high confluence. So in areas from the Midwest heading north up into Carnarvon in particular, we have an incredible confluence of solar and wind. We also have a magnificent, perhaps underappreciated tidal resource in the Kimberley, and very strong resource going right over along the coast to the South Australian border. We've of course got plenty of land. And just 2.6 million people. And we've importantly got a skilled workforce. We've got a workforce that has had 4 decades in oil and gas and in mining services. So there's a high degree of technical capability that we believe that we can transform into WA. it transform obviously into this new industry. And yesterday, just talking to a number of smaller companies in Western Australia that, you know, are developing some great new technology in this area. I think with a bit of support, we can really drive both an upstream processing and a downstream processing. So I've got here at least 30 renewable projects. I was talking to someone yesterday that reckons there's 70 renewable projects in WA, so we'll be doing a recount. But one of the interesting things, as you can see, is that they go all around the coast, from wind and solar projects based around Eucla, all of the way up to hydro-based projects in the Kimberley. And look, we don't think it is at all fanciful for us to be looking at of saying that we could use around 100 gigawatts of renewable energy for hydrogen in the next 10 years, and that we could have that capability increased to 200 gigawatts by 2040. And just to give you an idea of the scale of all of the stationary energy in Australia, at the moment, annual stationary energy is about 70 gigawatts. So this is a massive scaling up. So when we put our hydrogen strategy out, developed that in 2019, we are constantly revising this, because this is an area where change is occurring very rapidly, and things that at one stage were considered just 2 years ago not likely to be feasible are today very feasible. So it is a rapidly moving space, but we know we're looking very much at transport. If you think about what's going on in Australia, we bring in all of our diesel, we bring it in on ships, diesel fueled or bunker fueled ships. We then put that diesel on trucks that are powered by diesel and cart them thousands of kilometres around the state. I mean, it is the most nutso idea when you've got the ability to substitute that with locally produced hydrogen. So the transport application and the fuel security that can offer is tremendous. And we've just last week announced a special $10 million project where we are asking fleets, whether they're buses or trucks, to come forward and so that we can get some fleet happening, overcome that barrier, which is the greater capital cost and lack of refueling infrastructure. Remote applications, same thing. We relying so many of our power stations. I'll talk a little later on about what we're doing in Denham. The hydrogen blending into the natural gas networks. This is a great opportunity. We've got lots of 45%, for example, of energy used in a household comes in Perth at the moment is from gas. If we could start having a renewable hydrogen element in that, and same in terms of our industrial processes that are using gas to achieve the high levels of heat. And of course, export, as I said, is going to be an important part of that. So we had, so at the last budget, we put in $61 million extra into our hydrogen projects. That's taking around 90 million we've got to work on this. We've also got a range of other funds, like $100 million New Industries Fund, which I'm hoping to be able to raid. A $50 million industrial land fund to help that we can also use to unlock the potential. And as I said, one of the funds that we'll be using, the transport fund, part of that is not only to drive the adoption in the transport sector, but to create some of that early demand, because we've got to get the ball rolling, got to start getting the skills up, and we need an early demand. So that's part of our demands stimulation. We've funded a whole heap of feasibility studies because there's new and interesting things coming forward all the time. Projects like Global Energy Ventures, which are looking at the compressed hydrogen shipping solution. There are 4, 5 different alternatives for exporting hydrogen, and and the compressed gas obviously is one of those, and we're trying to assist with exploring that fully because of certain advantages it has to these nearer markets. And a very interesting project with BP, which is using organic waste, including tallow, to generate methane, which is then extracted and mixed with renewable hydrogen to produce a diesel substitute that will, and we can use ICE engines, it's not reliant on using fuel cells. So we can use the existing technology, existing product out there to get this happening. We have got 5 capital works projects. One worth talking about is Horizon Power. This will be the first our project that we've got with Horizon Power in Denham, solar and wind farm, creating hydrogen on site with the potential of replacing the 1 million litres of diesel that they are currently using to keep the lights on in the town. So a great example of remote application, and a range of other projects there, including working with our good friends at FFI on their Christmas Creek Mobility Project, looking at how refuelers and fuel cell buses will perform in the harsh conditions of a mine site. Some other notable WA projects are the recent announcement of the Woodside project, where they will be taking renewable energy off the grid and eventually using up to 3 gigawatts of renewable power through the Southwest Interconnected Grid to create hydrogen. I think, again, just an example of how rapidly this industry is changing. You know, only a couple of years ago, the orthodoxy was that you would have to be able to have something that could operate at least 18 hours a day to fund the cost of the electrolyser. That is now, as electrolyser prices are decreasing, the ability to use more intermittent power sources are increasing. Province Resources partnering with Total Eren, big French company, and they are still talking to us here. We're being very nice to them, not lying, being very honest. And they've got, we're looking at a very significant project around Carnarvon. We have Intercontinental, both with the Asian Energy Renewable Hub, 650,000 square metre project, Western Energy, Green Energy based in Eucla, which is a 50 gigawatt project. So these are massive. On the world scale, if we can pull all the pieces together and get those industries up. So as I said, I think we've already talked about the transport EOI. That'll be, I think, a really important step forward, and so hopefully we'll be getting that project underway next year. Land tenure, of course, is a massively challenging and complex area. We've got all of the issues surrounding native title, and then the complexity of how we set land aside free of mining tenements to give investors in these multi-billion-dollar projects enough security to move forward. We've got an amazing amount of work that has to be done in regulatory reform and certification so that This industry is going to rely on very much on there being a high degree of credibility in the certification space, that what you're buying is indeed green energy. So we've signed up to foundation member of the Smart Energy Council's Zero Carbon Certification Scheme, and Rebecca's team, we're working hard to try to get on top of all of the issues associated with regulatory reform, the sorts of changes that we need to put in place in our legislation to make this an industry that can get off the ground. We're leading a proposal. We're bringing industry together in the Pilbara and the Midwest to put forward submissions to attract federal funding. Federal government have announced 7 hydrogen hubs. We believe as a third of a continent we should have, and given the nature of our resource, at least 2 of those could go there. So an enormous amount of work is going to pull those together. Our hydrogen hub around the Midwest, around Oakajee, which has sat there as an empty paddock for 25 years, we've now re-envisaged as a centre for renewable energy and hydrogen production, and various downstream processing opportunities that will emerge when we have cheap and plentiful hydrogen gas available. So that's a 5,000 hectare site. We went to an EOR, we had 65 consortia expressing interest, so we're now working through the detail of an activation plan, how we can sequence the development of that site. So building our local manufacturing capability, we want to be not just dig and ship, we want to get in there on the ground floor, be developing the electrolyzers, the membranes, etc., that will drive this industry. And we also want to make sure, and we're investing in this also, which is looking at how then we can actually do things like manufacture steel, manufacture aluminium here, once we have this plentiful supply of cheap energy, and the ability of us to get the premium for the greenness of the product that we create. So it's a very exciting time. These projects are not easy to get off the ground. Getting the risk capital is always a big issue, but I think we are making some progress. And I really look forward to us seeing this as a great decarbonising opportunity for Western Australia, and for us making a very significant contribution to the decarbonising of the global economy. Thank you.
Most of our audience will know that Minister McTiernan had a long, distinguished career in state parliament, spent a number of years in Canberra and federal parliament, but then realized that a lot of the real work happens here on the ground in the state level. And so we're very fortunate to have her back here in her current position, driving so many of these important developments. So thank you for your opening remarks. We're now delighted to have a virtual, or at least beamed in keynote speech from one of the true thought leaders in the field, Dr. Tanaka Nobuo, a dear friend who is currently the chairman of the Innovation for a Cool Earth Forum, but will be known to many of you as the former president of the International Energy Agency in Paris. He served for a long time as chairman of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, is a fellow at the Institute for Energy Economics, Japan, and is someone that I've turned to for decades now to help understand some of these trends. And so without further ado, we're delighted to have joining us live from Japan, Dr. Tanaka, over to you.
Thank you, Gordon. Dear Madam Minister and Suzuki Soryoji and other excellent panelists, I'm delighted to be invited to this meeting and talking about the hydrogen in the future. Let me share the screen now. The subject today is a golden age of hydrogen coming? When I was executive director of the IEA, we have published the World Energy Outlook featuring, are we entering a golden age of natural gas? Certainly, because of the shale gas revolution in North America, the golden age of natural gas has happened. Japan contributed by trading liquid natural gas, LNG, and together with Australia, Brunei, Alaska, and other gas producing countries. Now, IEA was established at the oil shock of 1973, but IEA created IEA shock by this publication called Net Zero by 2050 several months ago, because it is quoted that energy groups or corporations, countries must stop new oil and gas projects to reach net zero by 2050. In fact, by this publication, if net zero by 2050 happens, already the demand of oil have peaked in 2019. And even for natural gas, the peak of demand is coming in a few years, before 2030. Of course, IEA's roadmap is backcast, it's not forecast. If the net zero or carbon neutral happens by 2050, as 120 more countries has pledged to do so, that story is just as mentioned here. 70% of electricity generation globally should be solar or wind. No, net zero electricity should be globally happen by 2040. And no new oil and gas field approved for development this year. So it's a shocking, but as a backcast, this is what IEA econometric model tells us. Of course, not only 124 countries, but many megatech firms announced their target much earlier than the governments for carbon neutral. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, these companies are calling for the carbon neutral, including all of their supply chain companies. And automobile sector has moved toward the same direction. Mercedes-Benz supply chain to become carbon neutral by 2039. And many financial sector is now moving toward so-called SDG or ESG investment. And because of this, many of the Japanese firms should go also carbon-free or whole new renewable. As Sony or Panasonic, if they want to sell their products to Apple, they have to do the same. So I call this a demand side driven and financial sector pushing energy transformation. It's not supply side. It's more the demand side driven. This is a feature. IEA says the difficulty even for the carbon neutral is the existing energy infrastructure, mainly in the coal or power sector or heavy industry like steel and cements and heavy trucks. But industrial side and power sector will be the more serious problem because it takes years to deplete these infrastructure. And many of them exist in emerging Asia because these are the young countries with young infrastructure. So how to decarbonize these infrastructure is a key element for global carbon neutrality. hydrogen could be a common solution for the energy future. This is what IEA announced in 2 years ago as a future of hydrogen. It can facilitate more renewables. It can help decarbonize hard to abate sectors, enhance security by diversified sources, and also help fossil fuel exporters decarbonization with CCS, carbon capture and sequestration. Japan has been leading the hydrogen economy, starting with this beautiful car, the fuel cell vehicle of Toyota Mirai since 2014. Japan established hydrogen strategy as early as 2017. But with the focus too much on the transportation sector, on a passenger vehicle, we talk about how many refueling stations a year, more than 100, 200, and not really advancing fast enough. Meanwhile, China and European Union overtook Japan for the hydrogen usage. Japan has last year announced carbon neutral by 2050 by former Prime Minister Suga. And Suga-san was really drastic announcement of carbon neutrality. I was really surprised. But METI taken his announcement, created so-called green growth strategy. The carbon neutral is the huge opportunity for the for the industrial policy and transformation. And this is the manifest for hydrogen future. Fuel ammonia, hydrogen turbines, and even nuclear power is used for the hydrogen, fuel cell ships, and so forth, so forth. The golden age of hydrogen may come if these policies could be materialized. JERA, the Tokyo Electric and Chubu Electric joint venture, announced carbon neutral by using clean ammonia and hydrogen, co-firing with coal and gas. This is a very interesting model for decarbonizing the power, coal power or gas power in other emerging Asian economies. There are two ways of making clean hydrogen. One is green hydrogen, as Minister McTiernan has been mentioning. And also another one is a blue hydrogen with from gas by carbon capture and storage. Australia has a huge potential of green hydrogen, of course, by renewables, but also with blue hydrogen with CCS. But the supply places and demand side has been very much remote. So how could we connect the supply to the demand is the key. The supply chain of clean hydrogen is under the construction or the planning, but it is the precondition for a golden age of hydrogen coming. This map shows a clean fuel ammonia association and other potential methods of transportation of clean hydrogen. One is the liquefied hydrogen and Kawasaki Heavy Industry has built the liquid hydrogen carrier, and Australia with the blue hydrogen is under the plan of transportation. Organic hydrate, MCH, methylcyclohexane, is the project of Chiyoda Engineering, and Brunei is exporting blue hydrogen to Japan already. Ammonia is under the consideration with Saudi Arabia and the Middle East countries, Certainly, Australia has a huge potential of exporting green or blue hydrogen or ammonia. Russia is now coming into the game of possible exportation of hydrogen. Japan has started LNG trading 50 years ago, but in the future, this new hydrogen transportation supply chain would be our top subject. Europe is now moving toward hydrogen mobility by pipeline. First, mixing hydrogen to the gas pipeline, but eventually dedicated hydrogen pipeline could be the very important security for European Union. It is called a backbone. I have been a chairman of this Northeast Asia Gas Pipeline Infrastructure Forum, but not only gas, but hydrogen can be traded in pipeline. This is a very geopolitical nature of the Northeast Asia. Of course, another idea of connecting power grid line and sending the renewable energy is another option. Masayoshi Son of SoftBank is always promoting the idea of trading the renewable energy by connecting grid line. He called it energy for peace in Asia. Certainly, the ASEAN countries are preparing the idea of such grid connectivity. Australia has an idea of selling green electricity by connecting grid line. So there are many different ideas, but these use of renewables and innovation is the key for the future. ICEF, Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, is a place for calling for all the kinds of innovation for the future. But we also think gender, women, and youth is very important for the transformation. Just transformation, or justice in the transformation, we have to mobilize the power of women as well as young people. Climate change is not gender neutral. Climate change is not generation neutral. We have invited many young people for the ICEF this year, and one of them, this Aditi Velmo, has proposed very interesting idea of design justice in nuclear. Nuclear power can be very flexible source of energy in the future by small modular type reactors and new design, which engage more the local communities for the design of the reactor from the beginning. More safety, more passive safety, or say waste disposal site problems and the decentralized way. Nuclear also can be a player in this whole system. Ladies and gentlemen, we think the future of decarbonization depends on many elements and innovation, and we need all of them. And hydrogen certainly will be the key element of the just transition and decarbonization of all of us. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tanaka. The first place I ever encountered PowerPoint was in Japan in the early 1990s. Although we didn't see Dr. Tanaka's face throughout it, he guided us through some of the fundamental challenges global, and as we had hoped, helped put our discussion here today very much in a global context. As you'll note, the report that we're going to be discussing in just a minute, Fueling Cooperation, the Indo-Pacific Hydrogen Transformation, really is about how we cooperate together in the Indo-Pacific region. We're going to take a brief break right now for lunch. Lunch will come out and we'll have service, and we're going to come back in just about 20 minutes to kick off a panel conversation here. But again, thank you, Dr. Tanaka. I realize you're online. We'll be joined online by other speakers for the panel in just a minute to make sure this truly is a regional conversation. But hopefully we've kicked off the conversation and started all of you as the audience thinking about some of the questions you might ask to take our state strategy and some of the things in this report and put it in the context of that report that was given to us by Dr. Tanaka. So thank you again so much. Appreciate it. We're fortunate to be joined here on the stage in person by my colleague, James Bowen, who's the one who actually wrote the report, did the research. He's a policy fellow here at the Perth US Asia Center. He's been affiliated with us for quite a while as we shamelessly kind of use his research. And we valued him so much, we brought him on full time at the beginning of this year, and we're delighted to have done so given this report. I earlier introduced Minister McTiernan. We're very fortunate to have her leadership in the state, on the state government level, not just obviously on hydrogen industry, but on her broader portfolio, including agriculture, food, the regional development, et cetera. And all of those, as you see from her presentation, and actually as you saw from Dr. Tanaka's presentation, are all very much intertwined and tied together. And to make this really a global in terms of a discussion, we're delighted to be joined virtually behind me on the stage, and we can see the pictures down here, live from Glasgow. It's something nice to say this week. We have with us Fiona Simon, who's the CEO of the Australia Hydrogen Council. I know it's early in the morning there, Fiona. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be interesting to hear some on-the-ground perspective from you on that. We also have Ambassador James Choi. James was a former Australian ambassador to South Korea, has recently retired and joined POSCO as an investor. James has been a kind supporter of the center over the years, and now, given the regional focus of much of the research and the importance of countries like Korea and Japan in this discussion, we thought we would benefit tremendously from his insights as well. So Fiona, James, thank you both for joining us. Minister, thank you for staying on. We know you have a very busy schedule. And James, to you, thank you for writing the report. We appreciate it. I want to start with you if I could. We've already had a pretty robust discussion, but I'd like to kind of get your reaction to the initial presentation from the minister and from Dr. Tanaka, but also your framing of the issue, particularly as we now move into a discussion that's much more about kind of how we work together in the Indo-Pacific to make this more of a reality. So over to you.
Sure. So I think the title of the report really captures what we're talking about, fueling cooperation. And I think that the two presentations today show the two vital elements of that and the complementarity between countries such as Australia, who most significant plans in this space, if you look around different jurisdictions, are around becoming an export superpower in the hydrogen space. And if you look at Japan, which is leading the demand side creation sort of trends within the Indo-Pacific region, which is emerging also as the center of trade and investment around hydrogen. So Europe has a big presence in hydrogen, but the trade and investment side of things is going to be dominated by the Indo-Pacific because of existing trends around resource scarcity that carry over into the renewable space as well and into the decarbonized future that we're looking at the moment. So basically, the report makes the argument that there's a great opportunity, but more than an opportunity, I would say an imperative for the countries that are involved in building up the hydrogen value chain to work together on various aspects of doing that. And I say an imperative because basically, if you look at a country like Australia, our top 3 trading partners at the moment have all committed to net zero by the middle of this century. And the Reserve Bank of Australia recently did some modelling around that, what that would mean for our key export industries such as coal and LNG as they exist at the moment. And you're looking at pretty precipitous drops in the level of trade that we have with those countries. So in the report also we look at the way that this hydrogen opportunity that Australia has and that the region has could be a strategic boon as well. So if we look at the relationships that a lot of these countries have, Australia, Japan, Korea, as I say, a lot of that is based on energy trade. And if we're looking at the existing profile of that energy trade, it's going to change under the decarbonisation strategies. So hydrogen can be the big opportunity there to not only maintain economic development in the region, but maintain diplomatic relationships and some of the actual other strategic benefits that come with that. And I think like the biggest, obviously, strategic benefit of that is fighting climate change, that we have to remain focused on that. That's the big prize, basically, with hydrogen. But there are other things that come from that as well. Energy security can be increased by bringing hydrogen into the mix, by diversifying the energy mix. There's also a lot of studies now that are emerging around the nature of the hydrogen export market. And basically, it looks like there's going to be less of a position for the existing hydrocarbon powers who tended to be authoritarian governments and bring a lot of problems in terms of energy security and other geopolitical dimensions as well. So countries like Australia, Chile, a lot of other stable market economies to some extent are more likely to play a dominant role in the future as well. So as I said, the big overarching argument of the report is that hydrogen creates a great opportunity to revitalize economic and strategic relationships in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, thank you, James. And again, congratulations on the report. My growing and impressive research team at the Perth US Asia Center all realize they have to write for me. In other words, if I can't understand it, then it's probably not better for the public market. But these reports, and you all have copies in front of you on the table, are really helpful. I mean, if you want to know the difference between green, pink, turquoise, blue, gray, or brown hydrogen, there's wonderful charts that lay it out there. And it also begins to kind of make those points. We've also got out in the tables out front short 2-page executive summaries for some of the core recommendations. So congratulations again to you. Fiona, if I could turn to you. First and foremost, we had a wonderful kind of scene setting keynote presentation from Dr. Tanaka Nobuo, who clearly continues his deep involvement with the International Energy Agency. So he gave us kind of a global perspective from the IEA. But you're now on the ground in Glasgow. I was discussing this with the minister at lunch. One of the things that makes hydrogen that much more topical today than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago is the changing debate on climate change. So you mind giving us a little bit of a on-the-ground perspective in terms of how that climate change debate, what's happening in Glasgow today, impacts on this paper and how we're looking at this here from WA?
Great, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. It is 4:40 in the morning for me, so please do excuse me if my words get a bit jumbled at times. There's a real buzz on the ground here, which is fantastic. The sheer number of people at COP is phenomenal, and there's just people from every country. Lots of wonderful traditional outfits, traditional costumes. So there's this huge buzz. I think it's very much around like-minded people from everywhere, talking about climate change and what it takes to prevent it, to halt it, to reduce it. I think what I've found is that there's still not sort of the targeted discussions that are happening on the ground because it's just a big conference sort of exhibition centre. And the Australian pavilion's also sort of quite small and hanging off to the side. I understand it's the first time we've had one, so it's great that we now have one. But I think I think that we're not as centre stage as we might be, although we do have apparently the best coffee for the whole conference. I haven't seen a lot about hydrogen being discussed. There's certainly a focus in the Australian pavilion on the newer technologies and how those technologies can be used. For example, there's this fantastic organisation who's been there recently looking at storing carbon in cement. We are seeing this sort of newer technologies, and so hydrogen, I think, is still waiting for the right conversations to happen. Although I'm on a panel this morning with Minister Taylor and the head of the IEA to talk about hydrogen, so we'll see how that unfolds. So I guess we're still looking to put meat on the bones of how we do it, how we translate all the buzz into genuine opportunity and the collaboration that's so important, the markets that need to get going. So I imagine that'll be the basis of many conversations in the coming days.
Well, thank you, Fiona. I liked your framing. The hydrogen is still waiting for the right conversations to take place. One of the underlying conclusions, I think, of this report, and James, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the conversations that does need to take place is building a international infrastructure, which is essentially allows a pipeline, not a physical pipeline, but allows energy exports. In his remarks, Tanaka Nobuo frame that challenge as how do you connect, the supply side with the demand side, and that obviously requires that network. If from your position as head of Australia's Hydrogen Council, do you see that conversation starting? That there's a recognition of a need to build an infrastructure for exports?
There's the difference between the conversation that talks about the importance of it and the need to have further conversations, and then those actual conversations that make it happen. I'm yet to see those more substantive conversations. However, the other thing about COP is that many of us, we're not party to the proper sort of inner sanctum where people are having some of these conversations. I think that, so there was the release of the low emissions technology statement yesterday, where we heard from Minister Taylor and Dr. Finkel, among others, where they were again promoting the need for us to have sophisticated views on hydrogen, on collaboration and the like, where they have now raised infrastructure as a more important part of the mix. So we hadn't seen that elevated quite before. We actually wrote a white paper that was very well aligned with the paper from the Perth US Asian Centre, and released that about 5 weeks ago, where we were focusing on just the sheer scale of what is required to get us to net zero as Australia. And even before you touch hydrogen, there's the enormous need for renewable electricity and for dealing with some of the thornier issues, because while we have, we do have the land, we have the sun, we have the wind, that land's not free. That land has existing rights. How do we think about that? How do we address social license? How do we understand the regulatory piece? And so I think we haven't yet seen the right developments of the kind of coordination that I think is required. The Australian government is still very much sort of expecting that it's going to be about government doing bits here and there, but waiting for the markets to establish themselves and for people to make choices. Certainly my concern is that we don't have the markets even close to people being able to make choices. And the infrastructure needs are very much part of that too. So I'd say that the infrastructure discussions that we need to have not occurred yet.
Well, thank you. And I want to come back to your comment on scale. But first, I'd like to get a question to Ambassador Che, to James, and then back to the Minister again. James, during your tenure as Ambassador, clearly you were part of many conversations on hydrogen, given where Korea has centered itself on this issue. And that probably extends to your current involvement with, what I was just telling the Minister is Australia's actually #1 individual, business partner or export destination in the world, which is POSCO, as a single company, right? So our biggest customer in that regard. They are clearly interested in Australia. Could you kind of, not just Korea itself, but could you kind of frame regional interest in Australia, given the conversations you've had on this over the years?
Sure, Gordon, and thanks for hosting this event, and thanks to James for writing the fantastic report. I wish I had this report when I was in Seoul, so I could shop it around. A bit too late, but anyway, it's great to have it here. In terms of regional interest on hydrogen, certainly during my time in Seoul, but also in my time back in Australia, speaking to various companies from throughout the region, I have never seen the hydrogen agenda so hot. It's the theme and topic of most companies. They're interested in what Australia is capable of doing. They're interested in the supply chain that's developing. They're looking at how they can be part of this hydrogen story. That's, I think, a way to summarize the fact that companies and countries now have to start looking at decarbonising and address the climate change issue. Again, I think that issue has now reached a peak in terms of attention, but also the need to respond. But the problem is, though, a lot of the rhetoric is there, but we haven't moved in terms of action. In terms of POSCO, you're absolutely right, Gordon. POSCO is Australia's single largest customer. And the supply chain of coal and iron ore that developed from Australia to POSCO developed during a visit by former POSCO chairman Pak Tae-jun in 1971. Most recently, the current chairman of POSCO announced that he will go to net zero by 2050. He needs to start importing hydrogen to make green steel by 2050. This is going to change the supply chain from Australia to Korea. And we have to start adjusting to that new reality. It's going to be a shift from carbon intensive materials to low carbon intensive energy, which is hydrogen. We have to start leaning into the market and start accelerating our own developments here in Australia, as Fiona said, to create the supply that will meet the demand that is clearly emanating from Korea, from Japan, but but also the region. We have to get our act ready to start supplying hydrogen to the region.
I unfairly saved the hard question for the minister, in that we had a short chat over lunch that if you talk about the hydrogen discussion 20 years ago or even 5 years ago, there's a reason that it is today kind of white hot, like James described. Fiona described part of that. That is, climate change has meant there's a topicality, a timeliness of that hasn't been there before. But there's also the technology. I see that we have Professor Eric May here in the audience. I mean, the tremendous amount of research that's done, the tremendous amount of progress that has been done on the technology means that things are not less conceptual. And yet, we're still kind of in a situation where we've heard from both that we have to move beyond talking it to doing it. You gave us a lot of specific examples,
Yeah,
but I guess the question is, how do we move to the do phase?
but look, can I tell you, it's sort of like, it's a bit like being in a parallel universe listening to some of the presentations, because I can tell you out there, there are people with actual projects trying to get them up. You know, there's people with, you know, licenses, exclusive licenses over tens of thousands of square kilometres. They're engaged in negotiations with the traditional owners. They've got environmental approvals, either approved or they're happening. I mean, this is happening. This is not just notionally about discussions, but just as you would expect with a gas project, if you look at how long Browse took, or Scarborough. I mean, these things take time to get up. But the thing that and I'm going to go back to this because, I mean, there's no point having these discussions if we're not honest and frank. The thing that I find extraordinary is that, and we started off in this whole exercise, it was Japan and Korea and Singapore that were going to be, they were the parties that came along. But I look at all these projects where people are actually out there trying to build projects. Who are the people that are providing the funding? It's the French. The French are the biggest, you know, putting FFI aside, but, you know, you've got French interests that are getting in there, putting cash in, getting these projects developed. You've got Danish interests getting these projects. You've got Dutch interests. You've got Norwegians. I mean, in terms of actually getting in to the projects and saying, yeah, okay, well, we've got to spend $100 million to get this project from a standing start to fit. We're going to participate in that and then get beyond that, obviously, to the 10 billion or whatever. I see all of these European countries that are getting in there and actively participating and putting funds on the board. And that's the reality of what's happening. There are real projects that are, as we speak, are being developed. Now, it is going to take them a couple of years to get to FID. We know that. But they're not going to get there unless there's people putting some money into getting them to that point.
So you, in your initial keynote remarks, noticed how much you welcomed and encouraged kind of incoming foreign direct investment from our region here for the big project. What do we need to do as a country, Australia as a country, and WA specifically a state, to kind of get Korea, Japan, and the others across the line? Because as we do know well, and this is something that Stephen is quite fond of talking about, that so much of our last 60 years of history has been built on the backbone. And again, James talked about this as well, as these major resource projects, whether it's coal, whether it's iron ore, whether it's LNG, extension to the region, and we build a lot off from that to build that kind of backbone on it.
Yeah, and look, I mean, obviously, this is still there are issues around tenure. These are complex projects, but I just make the comment that doesn't seem to have frightened the French off from investing. So they are complex projects. And while we're here, we've got the Asia-US Centre. I mean, one of the things, I find some of this thing incredibly puzzling. We've got a company like Northern Minerals, for example, only dysprosium mine outside of China. The only people that were really willing to invest in it were Chinese interests. Like, how does that happen? You know, I'm puzzled. I don't know what the answer is here, but and whether or not it is the fact that really the European nations have taken on board in a much deeper way, and whether or not a lot of these have actually got huge superannuation funds at the back of them, that is leading them to be the people that are backing these companies. But there's heaps of opportunities out there. There's people with projects that look prospective, but they need to get to, they need investment. Now, it's about, there's risk associated with these things, right? And we're trying to do our bit through our government agencies to solve the tenure problems and to encourage us. But at the end of the time, we need active engagement. And if you want to wait until it's all wrapped up with a nice big bow on it, you might find you're a bit late to the party.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. I want to bring Fiona back in on this, and then you too as James too, because to be clear, the question I asked Fiona, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Fiona, wasn't, are there ongoing projects in hydrogen? The question I had is there progress being made in building an international infrastructure for an export network of hydrogen? And so I'm interested to get your response to the conversation thus far, Fiona, and then bring you back in, James, and finally James in Korea, in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra. Where are you at, James, right now?
Canberra.
Canberra, there we go. Fiona, over to you.
I do appreciate you clarifying that. Thank you. Because I think actually the Minister and I are not that different in our opinions. We absolutely have some fantastic work in Australia, and we've got governments like the Western Australian government who have been very much the sort of the champions and getting stuff done. And that's fantastic. I think for my hesitancy or my concern, it is about the sorts of things the Minister raised, which is how are we, and to respond to your question, Gordon, it was that broader international pull on the dollars. It was the coordination that's required, and it was the infrastructure, because I think I would love for our national hydrogen industry as it develops for it to be possible for that to be created by a handful of really big projects working in the States. I think that would be fantastic for the deals to be done without relying on the federal government to provide more dollars and more coordination. My concern is that ideally we would have more dollars and more coordination from the federal government in order to show the world how serious we are, because we have seen some fantastic announcements. We've seen things like the Hydrogen Hub funding, the $464 million for the 7 hubs, for example. There's this fantastic work that Alan Finkel's doing and talking to other countries. And I certainly get that, industry can't sit around waiting for everything to be tied up on a bow, but there is still a gap between where we are right now and I think what investors as a whole need to see. And that's the sort of thing where investor certainty is possibly too strong a term. Alan Finkel was saying yesterday, we just need to talk about investor confidence. But the sorts of targets and things that are federal, in particular the federal government could put forward to then provide more so that other countries invest more to encourage folks other than the 1 or 2 outliers who, like FFI, who are prepared to put huge dollars into it. How can we, bring everyone along and get the sort of infrastructure that needs to happen? And not sort of be running the risk of piecemeal processes where people aren't necessarily talking to one another. And by that, I mean the jurisdictions in Australia as well.
Ambassador Trade, before I go back to my colleague James here, can I get your reaction to that?
Thanks, Gordon. Firstly, the Australian government and also the state governments have done a fantastic job in stimulating the hydrogen market here in Australia. I'm certainly not criticising the efforts, certainly of Western Australia. Some of the projects there, as the Minister mentioned, are incredible in scale and ambition. And certainly the likes of the Asian Renewable Energy Hub are projects that I promoted while I was in Seoul. The issue though is that it's the pace of the development of the market here in Australia, but also the signals, as Fiona mentioned, from the government as to how they're going to lean into the market to boost and accelerate the creation of supply. And while I was in Seoul, I was getting inquiries from Koreans saying, when can we start importing ammonia? When can we start importing hydrogen? When are the commercial projects going to be ready? And I didn't have an answer to that. I appreciate that here in Australia, we're developing it. It will take time. But I guess it's the mismatch between certainly what I saw in Korea, the immediate demand for projects that are going to be commercial immediately. And then what I see here in Australia, the lengthy time frame that's going to be in the lead up to these big and impressive projects being commercial. I think we need to see here in Australia is doing more of what we are doing. Accelerate the time frame, lean into the market, especially from governments, to support the development and accelerate the development of the supply chain here, because there will be a demand, certainly in markets throughout the region, especially Korea. Again, I think we've done fantastic things with Korea. The announcement just recently between our two leaders of low emissions partnership, recently announced by leaders in Rome, that will accelerate the development of the supply chain. But as I said, I think all parties, both commercial but also governments, need to continue to lean into the market to shape and accelerate the formation of the hydrogen industry here in Australia, because there is a demand, immediate demand here in Korea.
No, thank you. And your comments line up very well with the comments we heard from Tanaka Nobuo about this phase really being demand driven, both in terms of the decline in certain previous forms of energy, but also what's coming here too. So James, then I'll come back to you to Minister.
So my comment on that would be, I don't think it's particularly surprising that a lot of the interest might be coming from Europe at the moment, because Europe does have a very well-developed hydrogen industry and value chains as well. And they're leaders in a lot of sectors, such as electrolyzer production, for example. So I think the broader argument, though, is the long-term opportunity, the big opportunity remains in the Indo-Pacific, and we need to find ways to build up the market there, because that will be the transformational opportunity for Western Australia. And I appreciate fully that there's frustration around the level of interest that we are seeing from those countries, but that remains the argument. The long-term transformational opportunity remains in the region. So one of the arguments that were made in the report, and something that responds to comments I've heard from interlocutors in Korea and Japan, is that there's a lack of international coordination around Australia's efforts or outreach from Australian companies. So they might be approached by one company one day, another the next day, and they're not really sure what sort of purposes they're operating at. So I think there's processes of competitive federalism involved there, and there needs to be some sort of coordinating mechanism. I wonder if James could also comment in that respect, that there's an institution, a body called H2 Korea, which performs that function in Korea. And in Germany, they have an institution called H2 Global, which performs that function as well. And one of the recommendations of the report is actually that Australia might look to copy something like that would actually coordinate our international efforts.
I'm going to go back to both James and Fiona on that, because obviously you have a response, but the minister's been patient. I think you had something else to add to that.
Look, I'm talking about investment capital. I'm not talking, and what we're seeing. And I don't think the Europeans are necessarily targeting our market because they want the hydrogen, but they can see the investment opportunity. And this is what, and we're very confident there is a demand, and people are confident there is a demand, but these are long projects, and this idea we've got to be getting it up tomorrow. I mean, first of all, you've got to go and choose your site. You've got to get your basic license for your first site. And then from that day, it takes 2 years of data collection. Like, it takes 2 years to actually do the site-specific data collection to found a multi-billion-dollar investment, because you actually, whilst Geosciences Australia will give you an overview, this is actually, you've got to get there on the site and do the monitoring. These are not things that are going to be done overnight. They literally will take time. And you need some people that have got some patient capital, because no matter how good government is, we're not going to be able to provide $100 million to each of these companies to get to the point of FID. And so this is the point that I think is interesting, that we've not, there's people out there that want to supply that are, but we need people that are prepared to put up risk. Now, we can totally de-risk the whole enterprise, but that will take many years. I think it's just interesting to see It's not that there's any uncertainty about where the demand is going to be. No, there is no uncertainty that the demand is going to be in Asia. But where is the investment? Where is the risk capital going to come from?
And Minister, you made a really important distinction that I want to highlight because in all these things, and I think all of our panelists would agree, it's not either or, it's both, right? But you made the distinction between a lot of the investment that's coming from Europe now is absolutely essential. They're precursors, they're technologies, they're components, right? And where the interest in the region, in your report, James, seemed to focus on a tremendous interest in the product, the end product, the energy.
No, but
And
that's
so-
what we're talking about. That's what they're investing in. You know, not the electrolyzers. What they're investing in is getting the
process to get us there.
Yeah, that's right.
No, I fully get that. And that's a really important way to frame this as going forward. James, there was a specific question to you about, having someone representing Australia writ large. We have a very cacophonous and wide open free market. We don't tend to coordinate well. Is that a particular challenge from us? You saw that on the receiving end there in Seoul.
Well, while I was in Seoul, I was representing all of Australia, and I welcome the active competition between the states. I was representing all the states and the Commonwealth of Australia. But now with my Commonwealth hat off, that competition, while it may actually increase the formation of the market, can sometimes not lead to optimal outcomes, because you do have individual projects and the individual states sending out their own individual messages on what they're doing on hydrogen. And for those certainly in Korea, or indeed many people in the region that aren't fully up to speed with Australia's federal system, are a little bit confused as to what the different state strategies and what the Commonwealth strategies will be. So I totally agree. We need a coordinated approach certainly in promoting Australia's hydrogen industry overall. Great initiatives from Western Australia, but also equally the emergence of the hydrogen hubs in many other states. We need to package that up and coordinate it and sell it to our region in a coordinated fashion.
So Fiona, when you're not busy in the early morning in Glasgow, I presume that's part of what you aspire to do with the Australia Hydrogen Council.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are one of many bodies in this complex ecosystem. In that, CSIRO's in there with its hydrogen mission. There are obviously the states and the territories. The federal government does have a presence, and as I said, Professor Finkel, Dr. Finkel in particular, is out there as a sort of special advisor and advocate for Australia across the low emissions technologies, including hydrogen. So we are we're a national entity, and growing all the time, and increasingly getting more and more international and major international players joining, which is fantastic. We're very much a policy-based body, so we're off talking to our members and everyone all the time, saying, well, what do you need from policy? And we hear regularly concerns about the regulatory frameworks. I think the reality of that is that the potential hydrogen market is so broad that regulatory framework has a conceptual meaning, but actually you need to get into detail, and there are regulators around the country doing a really good job of doing that. The economic and social license remains very important, but I think it's the economic piece, and that economic piece, I can only reiterate what already has been said, and James just put it very well as well. There is still a gap between what we're doing and what we could optimally do to demonstrate to the world that we're serious. And that is very much a Team Australia approach that can and should be developed. I suspect that the rhetoric, the progress, where we are right now is fantastic, but it would be so much better if it was on a foundation of Team Australia. I was hearing from parties like H2 Korea as long ago as 2 years ago about they're a bit confused about hearing from every individual state and territory and understanding how they can be packaged up. And there's no easy answer to that. There's some very good reasons why we do the things we do. But the reality is the rest of the world, many of our competitors are more coordinated. They have stronger ties between industry and government as a cultural matter. So H2 Korea is, yes, very much government and industry, hand in glove. That's not how we do things in Australia. H2 Global, I should say, is not that kind of entity. H2 Global is a market-making piece, which we're all hoping is replicated, particularly in our region. It'd be fantastic. It's a contract for differences type model to try to close the gap between what importing countries are willing to pay for hydrogen and what exporting countries are prepared to sell for. So that kind of thing, and particularly with Japan or Korea, would be fantastic in our region. So yeah, the huge benefits and the enormously positive aspects of us having a federal system, of us having the enormous sort of freedom and the market opportunities, all of those things that make Australia such a wonderful place to be and a strong trading partner. There's the yin and the yang to that, in that it also makes coordination that much harder compared to a country that has just one major government, and one that has culturally a much stronger tie between government and the industry. Those are the countries that we are also competing against. So how can we overcome any perceived disadvantage for us not providing as strong a Team Australia approach as others?
No, institutionally, we early at the beginning of this year, my colleague Jeff Wilson released a report adapting Australia to an era of geoeconomic competition. We've long held very dear our kind of very laissez-faire, non-interference in government thing, but we're in a very competitive era. And I find it quite interesting, whether we're talking about rare earths, I see Tim Shannon here, whether they're talking about batteries, whether they're talking about lithium, hydrogen, we are counting on countries that actually do have a little bit more close relationship between government and industry to do some of the big things that are harder for us to do in that process. But it's a really interesting policy question for the country going forward. Look, we've only got 10 minutes left. I do want to take advantage of those of you who might have some questions that I've failed to kind of cover, but I'd ask you to keep them pithy, short, and sweet, and do a brief self-introduction. I've got microphones on either side of the room. If anybody has questions, if not, I've got a pantheon ready to come. So anything that we haven't touched that you'd like to cover? Yes, Professor May, Eric May there. I got a microphone coming to you here.
Eric May, Future Energy Exports, CRC. Thanks to the panel and for the report from James. My question is about certification. It's going to be very important because it's not just the differences between blue and green. You're going to have green hydrogen often produced in the same location as sources of blue, and there's even the 50 shades of green problem where not all renewable energies have the same carbon intensity. So does the panel have any thoughts on how to do that and how it might be rolled out?
Minister, I might turn to you first. In your initial presentation was a nice focus on certification, then I welcome other comments as well.
And I agree that that certification is important, and that is a genuine area that government needs to invest in. And certainly we have joined a group, let me find the name of the group, that the Smart Energy Council Zero Carbon Certification scheme. So this is an industry-led guarantee of origin scheme that we are working with, various other governments are working with. Excuse me. Because that is a very clear area where you need, although this is being led by industry, it is being backed by various governments to do that work.
James, is that one of your recommendations, or is that?
Yes, absolutely.
I thought it might have been.
So, there's a number of international priorities and creation of standards, creation of certification, creation of regulation, harmonization of those is incredibly important. And I think that Australia could quite likely play a more prominent role in some of the institutions that have arisen around hydrogen, such as the Hydrogen Energy Ministerial that Japan formulated, and also broader energy institutions such as the IEA, or even broader than that, the G20, those sorts of processes. Certification should certainly be a priority for Australia in those. Yeah.
Thank you. And Fiona, over to you on that one as well.
Yeah, the certification is the one thing that everyone says is important, and it's been consistent for 3 years now. because yes, the reason why hydrogen is able to have its day now is because of global moves to decarbonisation. So, you know, it's not about creating hydrogen via fossil fuels and selling it in its fossil fuel form. You need to be able to demonstrate to potential customers that it has the appropriate green credentials. So the Australian government has been working, and this has been its big priority on a certification scheme, and has been working with 22 other countries through the IPHE, and has been leading some of the streams of work there. And it's very much about building up the carbon accounting method that needs to sit behind what might be a kind of branding or logo exercise about, you know, my hydrogen is green. And because there are different ways of making even green hydrogen, then it's not a simple branding exercise. It is about the carbon accounting that you do behind the scenes. So that's live, that's real. We will support that 100%. The Smart Energy Council, and there are other competing type of ideas coming through at the moment, tend to be more about the sort of the branding, and it's project based. So they have auditors come in and do it on a project basis, and that's a good thing to have. It is at the moment kind of competing with the work that the federal government's doing. The federal government is actually setting out something which is applied to projects, but based on a common a method. So we are hugely supportive of that work. It is not happening as quickly as we would have liked, but they're really making inroads now. And I would definitely advise anyone who's interested in this topic to go to the Australian government's website and have a look at the material. They've released a discussion paper. There'll be more material coming out, I think, in the coming weeks. They're also doing sort of on the ground trials to really sort of flesh that out. So I'd certainly say it's not a gap. It is just something which hasn't been finalised yet. So please do engage with that.
Okay, we've got one final question. We'll probably go here to Brad.
Thank you. My question is probably for James, but maybe others might want to jump in as well. So James, I noticed that one of your number one recommendation is around targets and need for targets. Mm-hmm. Do you see what kind of targets do you think we should be setting, and should they both be at a federal and state level? And maybe kind of just unpack that a little. Thank you.
So I think the state already has some targets in this respect in terms of market share. That's correct. I think the Premier has spoken about replicating what we already have in LNG, and I think that's probably not a bad way to actually set those targets. I think there's going to be a lot of doubts around volumes or those sorts of things. So I think market share is not a bad way to do it. And some of the ups, the bigger projections of where hydrogen might be by 2050, it's broadly comparable to what LNG or natural gas is at the moment. So I think that's probably a good strategy about what we're targeting currently to replicate what we have on the gas front or the LNG front. I think probably, once again, just for the purposes of coordination, we should set those as a federal level, and then states obviously could respond to that with how much of that they might be. Yeah.
And if we can just add to that, Brad, so one of the targets we had was based on occupying the same market share in the hydrogen. We also had a 10% of all distributed gas in the network being hydrogen. So that just some of the targets, like that first one, which we had put for 2040, there's a number of things we actually brought back to 2030, because when we started on this work of developing the strategy over 2018, 2019, things are moving so quickly. The technology is developing at such a rapid rate, and the aspiration and the preparedness of people to invest that, this thing is looking at happening a hell of a lot quicker. I mean, we're just constantly, every week you're learning about a new technology, a new approach that, has the potential to really bring this industry forward. So I think that's one of the scariest things is here when you've got a plan and you want to get projects off the ground. You don't want to be paralyzed by the fact that there's so much change coming that you can't ever get to a point of making a decision to get a project underway.
Well, if there's one thing that I took from the minister's opening remarks and her comments here, and then I've taken from the panel at large, is precisely that the things are happening. They're happening fast. We heard from Dr. Tanaka that they really are demand driven. And that demand, given what's going on in Glasgow and other places, is likely to come faster still. There's some fundamental challenges in that process. Our hope at the Perth US Asia Center in working in issues like this is recognizing that they're not issues that we're likely to solve in this room alone, or even in WA alone, or Australia alone, but they really do require that investment, as you described, coming from Europe, the tremendous thinking that's being done in Japan on this issue, on Korea, this issue, and that as we work together to kind of build the infrastructure that's so well described in your report, James, and in your comments there, Fiona, and in your experience there, Ambassador Choi, I think that we have a better chance of keeping pace with the demand-driven cycle that we're in right now. So I realize that the minister has a very tight schedule. You've been very generous with your time. We appreciate you joining us today. We're really, really appreciative of you, Fiona, coming in so early in the morning from Glasgow. We know you've got a busy schedule there. James, thank you for your long support. Congratulations on your new advisory role with POSCO. It's a company that has a long history here in Western Australia, and we welcome that as well. And on behalf of the Perth US Asia Center, James, congratulations on your report. Thank you all for making the time to join us. My particular thanks to my colleagues at the center that make putting things like this together look easy, but we appreciate your work on there. We urge you all to take a copy of the report with you to read. Share it with others. It's available on our website as well. But clearly, this is not the end of a conversation. Things are going to shift, and the pace of change is such that we're going to have to continue to work on this to ensure that we position us here in WA and us as Australia as a whole well as we go forward to debate our energy futures. So thank you. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you all. Thank you online.